Hi everyone, camera's still not fixed, but the indefinite solution I've arrived on is, I guess, just going to be fine. Whatever. I can still see what I'm doing. I'm recording a bit later than usual. Like, basically, if I was being consistent, this would also be a shorter episode. But what I've decided is, because it was basically just my fault, like I was just lazy about getting around to starting recording, it was one of those things where I was like 5 minutes late, and because I was 5 minutes late, I was like, oh, who cares, I'm like 5 minutes late, like whatever. And therefore I just had no motivation to actually do anything of any speed, because I was already like, oh, I'm 5 minutes late. It's just a disaster. Anyway, I think because you guys are owed like a full episode, I am just going to record for as long as I would record if I was on time. So that's what we're going to do, but we're not going to have much in the way of an intro. We're just going to jump into this video. How conservatives invented gender ideology. If you don't remember last week's episode, essentially what happened is I was responding to it. I can't believe I got 17 minutes into it, but I guess I did.
Under this framework, right-wing commentators turn transgender people into transgender isms, into evil abstractions that...
Okay, yeah, so this is where we were last time, and I was going to respond to it, but then I realized I had like issues and stuff. So essentially that is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, to talk about the ideology instead of the people. Like, there are so many examples of where you would do that. Like, if you have an issue with a religious point of view, then your objection isn't to the specific individuals who hold to that religion, but the religious point of view itself. Sorry, I just realized I really could afford to roll up my blinds a bit. There we go. Yeah. So, like, I essentially, I just think that's a really obvious point, that my objection isn't to transgender people. My objection is to the ideological belief that they uphold. And, like, I don't have, if someone says that they have a problem with the gender critical point of view, then I don't assume that that's them. Like, I would say that's a legitimate thing. Obviously, necessarily, if you have a problem with the ideology, you have some sort of problem with the people who hold to that ideology, because your problem with those people is that they hold to the ideology. But it's legitimate to talk about it either way. I could say I have a problem with transgender people because they, have a role in advancing this ideology, but by that same token, I could say, well, I have a problem with the ideology. And ultimately, since my objection to the people is because of their adherence to the ideology, it's pretty clear ideology is the ultimate issue that I'm, like, having here.
We need to debate into oblivion, as if people won't die along the way. We've all...
I mean, look, that's an appeal to consequence. Basically, if it would kill people if we debated whether or not 2 + 2 = 5, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't debate it.
But the phenomenon that we call trans kids actually has a nearly 100-year history. Though the terms
Sorry, I just I think the screen went temporarily black, which is fine. But yeah, well, the thing is, 100-year history isn't actually that long, is it? Like, 100 years in the grand scheme of human history is pretty damn short. So, and I think he said, or she said, whatever, I think this individual said almost 100 years. But the thing is, I mean, if you go back to the 1950s, you'd be talking about John Money, who was conducting all sorts of weird pedo experiments on kids. So, like, is that trans kids?
Gender divergent children in the Western world have
Sorry, okay, to clarify my point, gender divergent children have existed forever. Meaning people who, like there have always been boys who behave in a more feminine way. There have always been girls who behave in a more masculine way. That's what gender divergence is. So they have existed forever. The thing is, that's not trans. A gender divergent child is not a trans child.
Val was born sometime in the 1920s, and though assigned male at birth from a young age, insisted on living as a girl. Val's parents, well...
I don't know what living as a girl means. Like, what can that possibly mean? Because if you're biologically male, you can't live as a girl.
Trans people have captured the reactionary imagination despite making up less than 1% of the world's population.
Again, this whole thing about, like, percentages is really stupid because, I mean, isn't it funny? There was literally Occupy Wall Street where the whole point was, like, we are the 99%. So it's very established in, like, progressivism that you can oppose a minority of people who make up 1% of the population or less. Because, I don't know, it's funny, I saw like a really silly tweet recently. It was a really silly tweet because they didn't really say anything which made it sound stupid. They said 1% of the population of Sweden commits 67% of violent crimes. And I think they were trying to make some kind of point about race, but they didn't provide any extra any extra context. So I was just like, well, violent criminals probably make up way less than 1% of the Swedish population, and they account for 100% of violent crime. Like, it's just like a meaningless thing to say, to be like, well, did you know 1%? It's like, really? Well, yeah, obviously, if that 1% includes a majority of the violent criminals, they're going to account, like, without saying something about the 1%, like, it's just like you could take any random smattering of people, be like, let's make sure we throw in a disproportionate amount of violent criminals, and look, this 1% sample of the population commits 67% of violent. Well, yeah, obviously. So it's just stupid. But again, like, probably what it actually is I don't know, like Somalis or something. Okay, that's interesting. It just annoyed me that they didn't like it's just so vague, like 1%. Yeah, obviously. But anyway, the point is that, like I say, violent criminals make up far less than 1% of the population, and yeah, obviously you can have a problem with violent criminals.
In 2023,
And by the way, if it is like, let's say, for example, it is true that Somalis, I'm just picking like a random group. I mean, I would imagine, for example, it can't just be like black people or whatever, because I feel like there are more than 1% of black people in Sweden. But anyway, so let's suppose it's Somalis who do commit 67% of violent crime in Sweden. That is a legitimate thing to be like concerned about and focus on. I don't think that it means there's some kind of violent crime gene in like Somali people, because that's idiotic. But like maybe there's a cultural issue, or like basically I think there are solutions to that problem, and it would be really stupid to say, well, why are you even focusing on that as a problem when Somalis make up such a small percentage of the population? No, if there's like such a disproportionately high number, clearly there's something that warrants being addressed there.
Pope Francis called gender ideology today's worst danger, which is weird considering that most trans people I know can't even order extra water at a restaurant. But
okay, so you notice the issue here. Alex has said, oh, well, whenever they say that their problem is with gender ideology, what they actually mean is the problem is trans people. And like they're being disingenuous and saying the problem is gender ideology. So then when someone says gender ideology is a serious threat, Alex can respond, well, that's ridiculous, because most trans people I know are like really cowardly and socially awkward, so how could they be a threat to anyone? But you'll see the issue there, right? The criticism wasn't of the individuals, it was of the ideology, and that is precisely why it doesn't matter if they are, like super socially awkward and couldn't present a threat. If the ideology they're upholding is a threat, that's an issue. Like, I would imagine that most of the kind of far-right extremists on 4chan are probably quite socially awkward and wouldn't present a physical threat in themselves, but the rise of far-right ideology, it would be very legitimate to say that that is a threat, especially if you really oppose far-right ideology and think that it has a lot of issues. That's the problem, when people kind of fail to understand that someone's being, like when someone says what they actually believe, and then someone else says, oh, I refuse to think you actually believe that. And then that person says things consistent with what they've said they believe, and the other person says, that doesn't make any sense because you don't believe what you just said you believe. And it's like, well, the simple solution here is just to think maybe people, when they say what they believe, they actually do believe that.
What the hell is gender ideology? What idea could be so dangerous as to mobilize the world's most prominent political...
Okay, so basically, gender ideology is the idea that a biological male can be a woman. The danger there is that it's denying reality, the same way like the flat earth is a dangerous idea. And also, it's encouraging people to view the categories of man and woman in terms of sexist stereotypes, because, it's saying, hey, I'm a woman because I fulfill the role of a woman. That's dangerous. And of course, there's the fact that it associates all of this and relates all of this to surgery that we know has negative side effects. So that's all a pretty substantial danger, I would say.
Number 1, the distinction between sex as a biological description and gender as a cultural construction.
Wait a minute.
Describe gender ideology as the belief in a few different things. Number 1, the distinction between sex as a biological description and gender as a cultural construction.
That's so weird, because like I just did, for a moment I was like, yeah, that is an accurate explanation of the objection to gender ideology. People object to gender ideology because they think that sex is a biological description and gender is a cultural construction. Like that's what the people who are criticizing trans ideology are saying. So essentially, for example, I'm against trans ideology because I think that there is biological sex And then there is gender, which is, you know, like masculinity, femininity, roles and stuff like that. And those two things are distinct. That's my objection. But I had to do a double take because what is being claimed here is that the objection is that that is what gender ideology believes. But gender ideology doesn't believe that because, as we know, there are many, many trans activists who will claim that trans women are biologically female. So they're literally saying, because trans women fulfill the social role of a woman, that's gender, they are therefore biologically female. So trans ideology is actually against that idea that there's a distinction between sex and gender.
Also known as the sex and gender distinction. Number 2, the idea...
Oh, by the way, and the other issue here is, gender's not being defined, because it could be the case, and, people do use the word gender this way, that gender means the categories of man and woman. And yeah, obviously, being a man or woman, that is whether or not you're male or female. But the problem is, if you're going to use the term that way, you should clarify it, because then the question becomes, well, what do you mean when you say, when you're talking about masculinity and femininity, what word do you use for that? Because that can't be gender as well.
That sex and gender are not binary phenomenon.
Okay. Yeah, that's it's not a core issue. At the end of the day, if someone said, I think it's possible to oppose trans ideology and say, well, sex isn't binary because of case and these tiny number of differences of sexual development that actually do obscure the distinction between male and female. Those mean that it's not a binary because, if you've got two options and then you've got a third option of nothing, then even if that option is 0.0000001% of the time, that's still not a binary. So if that's someone's position, then I'd be okay, I'm happy, to see two biologists who really know what they talk about or what they're talking about going at each other to establish whether or not they would agree with that. But the point is that doesn't mean that person supports trans ideology. So this idea that sex, and of course the flip side is someone can believe that sex is binary and still support trans ideology, because they could say, well, there's just male and female, but a male can be a woman. The sex binary is not really relevant to trans ideology. It just isn't.
Number 3, the concept of gender identity as our internal and essential sense of gender.
The concept of gender ideology is our... Wait, gender identity, right?
3, the concept of
gender... the concept of gender identity as our internal and essential sense of gender. Well, yeah, I guess we just think that's nonsense. It's a kind of made-up metaphysical belief, so we would disagree with that, yeah.
The idea that one can have a gender identity that does not match one's sex assigned at birth.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that you can... Well, it's not necessarily that you can have that, but obviously it just doesn't make it accurate. Really, I mean, you could simplify this so much. The essential objection, the really basic objection is, 1, the belief a biological male can be a woman. And then, if you wanted to cover your bases, and the belief that a biological female can be a man, and the belief that biological males and biological females can be non-binary or basically exist outside the categories of man and woman. That's the objection. Really simple, distilled. You don't need to throw in all this other stuff, but okay.
I don't agree with this conception of gender.
Okay, that's interesting.
Neither does queer theorist Judith Butler, even though they're often blamed for creating gender ideology in the first place.
See, this will be... The thing about this is it'll be interesting to see whether or not the actual presentation of gender ideology, or I suppose the argument here would be that gender ideology isn't a thing, but the actual presentation of gender is totally different from this, and gender criticals and conservatives have been completely wrong about it.
I don't think sex and gender are as distinct as mainstream liberal discourses claim them to be.
Yeah, we know. Because, yeah.
You can be against this simplistic framework and still believe that trans people exist and deserve rights.
See, that's the really funny thing, right? Because if it had actually been as simple as gender ideology is the belief a biological male can be a woman, biological female can be a man, and, the whole non-binary thing, if that had been the presentation, then obviously that would be an example of this is the thing you have to believe. So essentially all you've done is you presented something where you've avoided addressing the fundamental claim and then said, hey, well, good news. You can agree with the fundamental claim and still reject all of this stuff. And it's well, yeah, because you specifically chose all of that stuff as a way of avoiding presenting the fundamental claim, it seems.
According to recent survey data, when Americans were asked whether or not they supported basic discrimination protections for trans people,
Okay, so do you favor laws or policies that would protect trans people from discrimination in job, housing, and public spaces? Absolutely, I do. Yeah, 100%. Because trans ideology is an ideology. It's a belief system. It's a worldview. And I've likened it to a religion. Would I support people having laws and policies that protect their religious beliefs from discrimination? 100%. And I would say the most reasonable way for a gender-critical person to understand trans ideology is as basically a religious point of view. I would imagine most of you out there would say that religious people should not be discriminated. Obviously, there are such situations where it would make sense. Like, for example, if you're recruiting for a imam at a mosque, you would want to discriminate based on people's religions such that only Muslims would be involved, like obvious situations like that. And I think for trans ideology, there are situations where you might say, based on this specific role, if someone doesn't know what a woman is, maybe that should count against them. But I think for the most part, we would all agree that someone shouldn't have their right to participate in society contravened by them holding to certain religious points of view. Since we all believe that, and I think most of us would agree, trans identity is basically like a religion. Trans identity and trans ideology, I suppose I should say, by that same token, should not be subject to discrimination.
But the same research showed that most Americans also believe that an individual's gender is determined by the sex they were assigned at birth.
Yeah, that makes sense. So essentially, this is a very consistent phenomenon in life. People might not agree with a position, but still think that those who hold to that position shouldn't be discriminated against. That's actually a good thing. It's not an inconsistency or anything like that. Again, the thing about also saying whether a person is a man or a woman. See, I like how the actual survey gives a much better way of phrasing it because, like I say, gender is a very ambiguous term. Lots of people use it all sorts of different ways. So the survey says, look, it's about whether you're a man or a woman. And then Alex, in kind of explaining this again, has to basically rephrase it to be more confusing by saying it's about, someone's gender being assigned at birth.
Americans canceled in a
why is that? Wait. Oh, okay.
Confusing twist. Americans support trans people in practice, just not in theory.
No, that's not what it is at all. You're so confused by a really basic concept. They disagree with what they're saying, but they think they should still have the right to not be discriminated against. This is so simple.
Has influenced their views on gender the most, the top response is what they learned from science. Let's break that down.
I mean, I've been hardcore someone who said I don't think that trans ideology has that much to do with science, and I'm not saying because it's anti-science. I'm saying even the case against it isn't a massively scientific case, as I literally just said. The sex binary doesn't disprove trans ideology because you can agree with the sex binary and still support trans ideology, and you can reject the sex binary and still oppose trans ideology.
The top justification for respondents' beliefs was still what they learned from science.
The answer for me would be philosophy, common sense, whatever.
Well, because science isn't really one thing with one answer. It isn't an oracle that gives us a final.
This pairs really well with my science denial video I did.
The process of producing scientific knowledge often involves power hierarchies, excluded voices, and gaps in our understanding.
I mean, I don't know. I feel like you're being a bit harsh on science there, because I think science is, for the most part, pretty good. I would just say that what people have considered science has not always been accurate. And also, you've got to bear in mind, look, most people are idiots. Most people don't know science. And to be honest, most people don't even need to know science. Science is a very unimportant thing in life. It's really tremendously unimportant, because what advantage does it have? What do I need to know about space or anything like that? At best, the only science worth knowing is the science that's kind of interesting. But unless you work in a specifically scientific field, you don't really need to know the science. So I would say science is way less worth knowing than philosophy and kind of basic logic and how to kind of understand and recognize sophistry and stuff like that.
Just that scientific disciplines, just like all other disciplines, exist within an evolving historical context.
I find this is quite a crazy opinion to have arrived at, because essentially what we got here is the argument, because people believe contradictory things, both believing that their ideas are backed up by science. Therefore, science is just like a made-up nonsense thing that, like, is anyone's guess, pretty much. And I realize that's an exaggeration, but that's kind of what's being said there. And it reminds me of, like, the atheists who will say, like, oh, because, like, some people read the Bible and think, you know, like, insert all sorts of, like, nonsense, completely unbiblical beliefs, and other people read the Bible and they think, you know, things that actually line up with what the Bible says, therefore the Bible just has no authority whatsoever. And it's like, well, that's not how it works, because, you know, like, I mean, usually I'd use the example of science as a counter to that and say, like, people can look at science and the natural world and come up with all sorts of different opinions, but that doesn't mean there isn't an objective truth to the natural world. The problem is I can't even really do that here, because we literally have Alex saying, well, because people look at science and have different opinions, therefore it's a nonsense thing. But what I would say is, well, no, that could only even begin to be demonstrated if you were actually focusing on people who seem to know a lot about the science. Like, that's the issue. There have been, I mean, like, my favorite thing with regards to religion is that there is a study that's done by a particular ministry, and it's of evangelicals, and it consistently finds that the majority of evangelicals are wrong about just, like, basic stuff in the Bible that no scholar disputes. So, like, that suggests an ignorance problem. And that's the thing. You need to be able to distinguish between, I mean, it's kind of like the epistemology, ontology distinction, but you need to be able to distinguish between what there is to be known and the public's possible inability to know that stuff because they are ignorant.
We find that the concept of gender was actually created to reinforce the rigid gender roles that conservatives claim it challenges.
Okay, like, that is, like, such an obvious point. Like, this is, like, supposed to be like a, did you know that gender was invented to reinforce gender? Hold on a minute, we're on part 1? What do you mean part 1? How can we go on part 1? We're 25 minutes in. Nonsense.
It's a well-documented history of non-binary gender categories in many cultures. Since the beginning of recorded history, most cultures seem to recognize, generally, two gendered categories: the male and...
Why are you talking about... Wait, what? Two gendered categories, the male... What are you saying?
female, the masculine and feminine.
The male and the female, the masculine and the feminine. And bear in mind, gender has already been used to mean man and woman. If I'm right, by the way, this video should be synced up with another video I'm doing, specifically responding to H-Bomber Guy, where basically H-Bomber Guy's like, oh, I don't like the way Bill Nye conflates all these terms. And I was like, well, the thing is, every trans ideologue conflates these terms all the time. And I think that comment there has just made it pretty obvious what clip I should use for the end of that video to advertise my Patreon, because here it is again. And like, what are the odds? Like, this is not, like, I've not contrived this, obviously. I mean, you know, this is like part 2 of the video. I didn't like plan ahead. I never plan ahead, but goodness me. There we go. So, since everyone who's like watching this right now is definitely watching it as part of the like teaser clip that I've put at the end of my YouTube video, definitely subscribe to my Patreon, because this stuff happens all the time. It's so convenient.
Men and women. But what does that mean exactly? Because these weren't always...
Oh, and by the way, like, sorry, I just like, you literally got there a specific, you know, like mention of men and women.
Now I get what you might be thinking. Penis and vagina, that's as
penis and vagina
biological as it gets. Case closed. But these weren't always biological objects.
What do you... What do you mean? What do you mean the penis and the vagina weren't always biological objects? What?
The body was not always viewed and therefore treated as a biological object.
What does that mean? What? How? I don't understand what you mean, because like it is biology. That's the humans. Look, I understand that you could say, well, it's not always viewed in like strict biological terms, but it's not viewed in strict biological terms now. Like, people don't view, like, just because people don't view things in a specific, of course people don't always view things in a specific like within the context of a specific discipline all the time, because we're human beings. We view things in all sorts of different ways depending on the context, but that doesn't change the fact that it's still like relevant to that discipline. You know, like I don't always think of the country that I live in, the UK, in terms of international politics, but that doesn't mean that it's not an object of international politics all the time, because that's what international politics is about.
Biology is a modern discipline that carries with it a modern life.
To clarify a point, biologists can talk about dinosaurs, non-avian dinosaurs, who lived before any human being existed. So there was literally not even an opportunity for someone to look at their body and say, that is, biological reality. No, but it still is and still was a biological reality, because that's what biology describes.
Biology is a 19th century invention born...
Wouldn't this imply that, like, back before someone came up with the idea of maths, that it wasn't true that 2 + 2 = 4? Like, you're implying that facts don't exist independent of someone's recognition of those facts.
He's saying that the modern biological sciences require a contemporary way of viewing the world. In order to...
Okay, like, that's true, like, you can talk about, but that doesn't mean that the facts that were being observed by these sciences weren't true back in the day. Like, they still are. They are, if any, like, they're retrospectively true. So, even if, like, we can say that cavemen and ancient Greeks and whoever had, you know, penises and that was a biological reality, like, we can say that now. Even though maybe they didn't say it at the time, but I imagine they probably still did recognize it.
Do biology, you have to be able to think in terms of abstract notions like life, systems.
Yeah, so like, yeah, the big question here is any of this going to be relevant to the suggestion that, like, biological sex doesn't exist or didn't exist in the past? Because, yeah, obviously you need, like, a worldview, and that worldview will affect the way you look at things, but you can't just gesture vaguely at the fact that one's worldview is kind of part of an intricate web of how they see the world, and then suggest that, therefore, there is no objective truth to the world.
That in books written after the 17th century, or in the classical period, the natural history of horses omits these fables and poems.
Like, what is the point of this? Yeah, back in the day, the idea of, like, a bestiary would include, like, made up, like, mythology as well, because they didn't know that was nonsense, or they didn't care about it. I mean, look, if you understand the Bible, it's important to recognize, like, just to take an example of an old book, that this idea that adding this stuff was wrong isn't necessarily true. Like, that they did have different conceptions of what it meant for something to be true, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't a truth to be recognized.
Because between the medieval and classical period, the rules for creating knowledge changed.
No, you idiot. That you can still pick up, look. Mythology. What? Oh, I must have got this from the, like, 13th century, right? Because obviously the rules of knowledge now say that you can't know anything about mythology. No, you can. It's just that we recognize that mythology isn't science. It's really that simple. Essentially, we've just got better at stratifying different things into different categories, but it still is all considered knowledge.
The medieval form of knowledge production recognized words and symbols as a part of the...
Look, I'm just going to reiterate this one more time before I don't say anything. There needs to be some explanation at some point of how all of this... Because, look, I can't just pause and show you every single thing that's being said, but there needs to be an explanation of how all of this demonstrates that biological sex isn't real, or, like, basically, you know, isn't concrete or whatever else. Because so far we haven't got that, and that's quite an important thing. So yeah, we'll see. But I'm just going to let it play, and so help me God, unless something very stupid is said, I'm not going to pause and say anything until we get to biological sex. And I want you to look, okay, 29:36, that's the time right now. See how long it takes before any of this is said about biological sex, and then I will let you know whether anything that was said in this time actually, because so far you can see none of this would evidence the idea, like, okay, yeah, they used to write about myths in the Middle Ages, and they wrote that alongside science. That proves biological sex isn't real. How?
Knowledge is not an objective and linear pursuit of truth, but a contingent, changing, and socially negotiated process.
Knowledge is not a pursuit of truth. I mean, knowledge is what happens after you've already pursued truth. But like the reality is that knowledge is something that you know. And knowledge is necessarily true. Like knowledge is by definition true. You can't know something unless it's true. Because if you know something and it turned out it wasn't true, you didn't know it, you just thought it. So yeah, this is just, oh God, it's just so stupid.
But when these neurodivergent plant dudes were making their little books about nature in the 18th century,
I would just point out, it's kind of ironic, like, because they didn't have the concept of neurodivergence back then, so it's hilarious to be like, I know it's a joke, obviously, but still, it's very ironic having spent all this time being like, oh, you know, like, things didn't exist, and then to be like, because I guess, like, the logic would be that there were no autistic people back then, right? Because what we've established is, until they had the terms to describe things, those things didn't exist. So, autism was, I guess, like, just came into existence as soon as we started using a word for it.
the classical natural historian would study gills and lungs and say, they don't have the same form, size, or shape. These things aren't observationally similar, so they aren't.
Okay, so what's being set up here is like basically an objection to the idea of focusing on function, because obviously we would recognize that gills and lungs are very similar in that they both have the same function of helping someone to breathe.
Though I am physically taking in an equal amount of visual information, when I watch The Simpsons versus...
Guys, can you believe this? So we're getting a long explanation of the context in which you might look for a joke in a certain TV show, and how you might be looking for a joke in a comedy show, but you're not looking for a joke in a non-comedy show, and therefore biological sex isn't real.
The anthropomorphic gaze towards nature shifted. Humans began to study nature as if it had a direction, order, function, system, ultimately seeking purpose.
Okay, I don't really know if I really buy that, because people used to be way more religious back in the day, so I would think that they still viewed the world as having some kind of function and purpose, because that is obviously a view you would especially have if you believed in a god. So I'm not sure. I do buy this idea that yes, biology nowadays, part of it is about recognizing function, that things exist for a reason because of, evolution basically. And that makes sense. I mean, also you can talk about how, obviously even in the kind of physical world with, black holes and stuff, you could say they have a function. It's not like a function that anyone prescribed for them, but the function, the thing that defines them as a black hole is that they suck in all the light and that makes them black.
We begin to put humans into boxes. We begin to impose mechanistic purposes that, under the label...
Yeah, I mean, so this is the pretty obvious direction to go, I guess. It did not need as long as was spent talking about it just then, which was insane. By the way, it's kind of funny because obviously I was like, hey guys, don't worry, I'm going to make sure that this one's decently long, because, even though I was start recording slightly later, I know that last week's was not very long. This one might also not be that long, because there is going to be a lot of stuff I just have to cut out, because obviously it was just, me not responding as someone else was saying loads of stuff. Yeah, the mistake here is thinking that because we recognize something has a specific function, therefore you need to do that thing. You don't need to breathe, you don't need to walk, you don't need to grab things with your opposable thumb, but it's worth recognizing that those things do have a function. Likewise, you don't need to reproduce, but yes, your reproductive anatomy does have a function.
Those are all just ideas. They're ideas that can be used in the service of creative, liberating theories or repressive regimes. Unfortunately, in the past 200 years or so, humans have tended towards the repressive stuff.
Okay, so I'm interested here. What argument is going to be given to show that thinking about biology in terms of function causes repressive thinking? Because the only example I can think of where we really focus on function would be biological sex, and I don't think that recognizing that biological sex has a function of reproduction would legitimately be used to oppress anyone. Because again, if you are saying, well, because your body is used for this purpose, you need to be reproducing, well, you're not actually understanding the science. The science doesn't say, there's an idea, you can't infer an ought from an is. So even if it's true that your body has that function, it doesn't mean that you ought to do it.
Western culture has divided humanity into two coherent groups with two inherent and opposing spiritual essences.
Okay. There is one huge issue here, which is that, as we know, there was just a whole load of time spent focusing on the fact that our understanding of science has changed, and that this idea of understanding science in terms of function only emerged with the capitalist, industrialist mindset of the 19th century. So, but then you're showing all these examples of human beings thinking that like women were inherently inferior prior to all that. So it's kind of, you're sort of undermining your own point here, because your argument's like, oh, the problem with this function thing is it allows us just to justify loads of sexism, but then you're literally showing that every single understanding of science we've ever used in history has allowed men to justify sexism. So clearly the problem isn't with the method you're using, it's with your desire to justify sexism.
There's no time to go over the history of the patriarchy and the gender binary, but let's just say that
no, we got to talk about some more Simpsons episodes.
by the 19th century, people were pretty bought into the binary opposition between men and women, and also that women sucked.
And again, here's a question. Which one of those things is the problem? Because I would say that it's not the idea that there is a binary opposition between men and women that is the problem, it's the and also women suck. It's kind of like, the problem is if you just said the first thing, people are like, well, there's not really a problem there, At worst, it's maybe inaccurate and not really a proper way of understanding things. But yeah, the problem is when you say, and also women suck.
The church's authority over cultural institutions began to slip away. Yet the model of binary sex still remained a core part of culture. Just that people began to
Again, I'm like, this is just like a complete self-contradiction. Because there you had, okay, with the Enlightenment, so that's like the 18th century, the church's control over the world slipped away, but the binary conception of sex still remained. But the previous claim was that the binary conception of sex only emerged in the 19th century with this functional approach to biological inquiry. So what's the deal? You're contradicting yourself. You're saying on the one hand, well, this biological sex idea, or like this binary biological sex idea, is actually a modern invention based on our particular methods and framework we use. But then you're saying, actually, it's something that has endured, and even as, attitudes in society have changed, it's an idea that's remained consistently throughout that whole time. It's like those two things contradict each other.
Point is, capitalism started capitalisming. Industry
Hello.
started industrializing, and governments started governing in new ways. And all these different sectors of society needed
Chrome
new
has
forms
crashed.
of knowledge in order to
I
do
can't.
that. Society was changing rapidly, and different interest groups wanted to study that change and use it to build their version of a new world. People wanted to investigate.
Okay, I finally fixed it. That was really weird. I couldn't pause anything. I didn't really have anything to say. I was just thinking to myself, it seems to have been stuck on the same image for a long time. And I was like, how do I fix this? And I was like, oh wait, I can't move anything. I can't pause anything. The video keeps going. So, all right, I managed to fix it though.
The most efficient way. These research agendas assumed that hierarchy and
Oh, there's a tit outside.
economic productivity were good things because capitalism needs hierarchy and economic productivity to produce results. There was a new collective atmosphere.
So yeah, in case you can't tell, we're at the point now where, everything's about capitalism. It's just like, look, I'm sorry, but males and females weren't invented by capitalism. That's just not true.
A culture.
Oh, goodness me, we are making a lot of progress there.
Final essence, some fundamental distinguishing characteristic that would finally explain all of the assumed differences between men and women, the masculine and feminine, the metaphor to end all metaphors, the logic of difference, etc.
Okay, so it's important to understand whatever's said now, the claim here is not just that these people were trying to find a distinction by which men and women could be distinguished biologically into two categories of male and female, but the desire to find one that also explains masculinity and femininity. So obviously that's going to be a much harder thing to have found, and something that we would not expect them to have found. Like, our argument as gender criticals is not that there is some essence to man and woman, or male and female, that explains masculinity and femininity, but just that there is a defining thing that distinguishes males from females into two distinct categories in a binary.
Biologists found that many species were naturally intersexual, or at least that most life forms carried diverse sexual potentials, and they eventually came to
Most life forms. Well, I mean, like, isn't there like something about how like the majority of life forms are like single-celled organisms and stuff? So I don't really know what that means, because like most life forms that we would think about, that we would engage with, that we would typically think of would be like reptiles, fish, mammals. Like, those are the life forms we typically think of. And all of those are sexually binary. I think universally, I don't think there's a single, maybe some fish, but certainly for, I think all reptiles and all mammals and all birds, sorry, I forgot to give birds a shout out, even though I think nowadays birds are considered reptiles, but whatever. Yeah, they're all, they are all binary.
that the truth of sex no longer originated in the spirit or in one single organ, but a flexible bodily network. Even Charles Darwin.
Okay, yeah, so that's the thing. Yeah, it's not about one single organism, it's about a network. That still works with the binary thing, because it's about function.
Our bodies, when exposed to different hormones and environments, are actually quite flexible and adaptable. Our bodies are the
So I guess this is where we're going to get to something like, and therefore, if you go on hormones, that means that you change from being biologically male to biologically female. Look, apart from anything else, that would at best be defending a trans-medicalist point of view. But either way, in reality, like the hormones that might cause a certain change don't mean that if you then take those hormones, you yourself have become that thing. Like, whatever it is that causes black people to develop darker skin, that doesn't mean that if a white person was able to get access to that thing and like inject it into themselves, that would cause them to be a black person.
A 100% man is as non-existent as a 100% woman.
For a moment, it seemed as if bodily understanding could have moved in a radically liberating direction.
Sorry, why would this liberate anyone? Like, what's liberating about this? How are you liberated if, like, some random scientist says, oh, no one's 100% man, no one's 100% woman? Like, how would that liberate me? How does that liberate anyone? It doesn't seem to have any relevance, right? Because, it doesn't affect what you can do or anything like that. And if it does affect what you do, it seems like you would need to be liberated from the ideology that says it affects what you do, rather than being liberated from the thing itself.
What are the consequences of modernist tropes like function, system, and instrumentality?
Alright, so I think that's where we'll pause. We're almost exactly halfway through. And we'll return to this next week. Presumably, I mean, depending you guys voting for that. I think this video is pretty interesting and entertaining. Like, yeah, there are moments where like a lot of nonsense is being said, but it's kind of like, it's not nonsense that annoys me, it's nonsense that I'm just like, wow, like how can you possibly think that's relevant? So yeah, we'll see. All right, everyone, I hope you enjoyed. I guess I'll see you all later. Like, that's all there is to it. Bye.